Most people look at a cheap cabin near a lake and assume there has to be something wrong with the building. Bad roof, bad foundation, bad road, bad neighbors. But sometimes the cabin is not cheap because the cabin is broken. Sometimes it is cheap because the most expensive part of the dream was never included in the price. You are not buying the land. You are buying the walls, the roof, the porch, the old dock, the wood stove, maybe the kitchen table that has been sitting in the same corner for 40 years. But the dirt under your boots belongs to someone else, a state agency, a school trust, a federal forest, a private timber company, a conservation landowner. And that one detail changes everything. It can make a cabin beside water feel strangely possible for a normal person again. It can also turn a beautiful bargain into one of the most misunderstood housing decisions in America. Because a leased land cabin is not a normal house. It does not behave like a normal house. Banks do not always treat it like a normal house. Counties do not always tax it like a normal house. Insurance companies may ask questions you were not ready for. And when the lease ends, the place you loved may not belong to you in the way your heart thought it did. That is why these cabins are so fascinating. They live in the gap between ownership and permission. And if you understand that gap, they can be one of the most affordable ways to get a real, quiet, personal place in the woods or near the water. But if you ignore it, the cheap price is the bait, and the lease is the hook. There is a version of the American cabin dream that still exists outside the luxury market. It is not on the front page of the big real estate apps. It is not usually staged with white bedding and a drone shot. It is quieter than that. It is a small structure on land that was never meant to be chopped up and sold as private lots. It might be on state trust land that has to earn money for schools. It might be tucked inside a state forest program from another era. It might be on federal land under a recreation residence permit. It might sit on timberland protected by a conservation easement where the forest stays open and working while a few cabin sites remain inside it. The common thread is simple. You can sometimes own the cabin without owning the land. That sounds like a technical detail until you compare the numbers. In many parts of the country, especially near lakes, rivers, mountains, or public land, the land is the real cost. The cabin may be modest, the structure may be old, the square footage may be small, but the dirt underneath it, the shoreline, the access, the view, the right to be there, that is where the market goes wild. So when the land is not for sale, the purchase price can drop into a completely different universe. This is why a buyer might see a cabin listed for a number that feels impossible. Maybe it is far less than a normal lake cabin in the same county. Maybe it costs less than a new truck. Maybe the annual land fee looks shockingly low compared with property taxes on a private lake lot. And the first thought is obvious. Why is everyone not doing this? The answer is that most people do not understand what they are looking at. And the people who do understand it often move quietly. The first thing to know is that cheap cabin can mean several different things. It can mean you buy a cabin from a private owner, then separately apply for the right to keep using the land under a state or federal lease. It can mean you bid for the lease first, then purchase the improvements from the prior cabin owner. It can mean you buy into an old state forest cabin program where no new sites are being created, so the only path is finding a current cabin holder who is ready to let go. It can mean a recreational license on private timberland, where you are allowed to build or occupy a cabin inside a 1-acre envelope, while the larger property remains open or managed for timber and public access. Those differences matter. A deeded cabin on private land is one kind of property. A cabin on leased land is another. A cabin under a federal special use permit is another. A cabin on a private timber license is another. They may all look similar in photos. Wood siding, gravel road, pine trees, lake at the end of the path. But legally, they are not the same animal. The mistake buyers make is falling in love with the photo before reading the arrangement. And that is understandable, because the photo is powerful. A small porch facing the water, a simple metal roof, a wood stove, maybe no one around for half a mile. It looks like escape. It looks like the thing you thought was gone from America. No giant mortgage. No suburban HOA. No bidding war against cash investors. Just a place. But the legal structure is the house behind the house. If you do not understand that, you are not buying a retreat. You are buying confusion. Let us start with the basic math. When someone buys a normal home, the price usually bundles together the land and the structure. Even if the house is old, the land may still carry enormous value because of location, zoning, utilities, access, water frontage, or future resale potential. With leased land cabins, those values are separated. The cabin can be privately owned, but the underlying land remains with the agency or landowner. That means the purchase price may reflect the building and the right to pursue or assume the lease, not the full fee-simple value of the land. That is why the price can look so low. But the annual cost does not disappear. It just moves. Instead of paying for the land up front, you may pay an annual lease fee, permit fee, license fee, local tax on the improvements, insurance, road association costs, special assessments, water agreements, maintenance, and sometimes transfer or administrative fees. If the cabin is remote, the cost of keeping it usable can surprise people more than the lease itself. A cheap cabin with a bad road is not cheap in mud season. A cabin with a failing septic system is not cheap when the county gets involved. A cabin with no legal water source is not cheap when you realize every weekend starts with hauling jugs. A cabin that cannot be financed like a normal house is not cheap if you need cash to close. This is why the first real question is not, what does the cabin cost? The first real question is, what exactly am I buying, and what exactly can end? If you are buying the structure only, say that plainly. If you are buying improvements and applying for a new permit, say that plainly. If the lease can be transferred only with agency approval, say that plainly. If the lease ends in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years, put that date on paper and stare at it until it feels real, because the end date is part of the price. A cabin on private land can still have problems, but the land does not normally vanish from your ownership because a permit term expires. A leased land cabin is different. The lease may be renewable. It may have a long history of renewals. The agency may want the use to continue. The program may be stable, but none of that is the same as owning the dirt. That does not make it bad. It makes it specific, and specific is where smart buyers win. In Montana, for example, some state cabin and home site leases sit on trust land. The basic structure is easy to understand, but easy to underestimate. You lease the underlying land from the state. If improvements already exist on the site, you may need to buy those improvements separately from the current or prior lessee, the improvement's owner, or the state. That means the land relationship and the cabin purchase are connected, but they are not the same thing. This is where buyers need discipline. You do not want to pay for a cabin before you know the lease situation is clean. You do not want to assume a structure is approved just because it has been sitting there for decades. You do not want to assume a dock, shed, deck, water line, septic field, or driveway is legal just because it appears in the listing photos. Old cabins are full of old habits. Someone added a porch one summer. Someone wired a shed. Someone put in a pipe. Someone moved a road. Someone built closer to the water than current rules would allow. Maybe everything is grandfathered and fine. Maybe it is not. Either way, you want to know before your name is on the paperwork. Pennsylvania has a different flavor. Its state forest cabin program is one of the most interesting examples because it feels almost frozen in time. There are leased campsites in state forests with 10-year leases and a very low annual lease fee compared with normal real estate costs. But that low fee does not mean the cabin is free from responsibility. Local taxes may still apply to the cabin and personal property. Water agreements may matter. Unpaid taxes can become a real problem. And because no new leases are generally being created under that old program, the path in is usually through an existing cabin changing hands. That is the pattern you see again and again with these properties. They are not always advertised like ordinary homes because they are not ordinary homes. They move through local knowledge, family decisions, small listings, cabin associations, foresters, public records, and patient letters. A person looking casually on the biggest real estate websites may conclude these opportunities do not exist. A person who knows what words to search may find a completely different world. Search terms matter. Leased land cabin, recreation residence, state forest leased campsite, cabin site lease, cottage site lease, state trust land cabin, improvements only, permit not transferable, Forest Service cabin, camp lease, timberland cabin license. These phrases do not sound glamorous, but they are the doors. And behind those doors, the rules change from state to state. In Maine, the story becomes more remote and more old-fashioned. Public reserved lands and camp leases are part of a landscape where not every cabin is a consumer product. Some are legacy camp arrangements. Some are sporting camp related. Some are old residential camp lots. The appeal is obvious. Deep woods, ponds, gravel roads, quiet country that still feels far from the real estate machine. But the practical side is just as obvious. A remote Maine camp can mean long drives, rough roads, seasonal access, limited utilities, serious winter conditions, and a lease structure that may be more about continuity than convenience. For the right person, that is the whole point. For the wrong person, it is misery with a wood stove. This is one of the biggest truths about leased land cabins. The lower the purchase price, the more honest you need to be about your lifestyle. Do you actually enjoy remote maintenance? Do you know what it means to open and close a cabin seasonally? Can you handle a road that is not plowed the way a subdivision road is plowed? Are you ready for mice, moisture, fallen trees, fuel deliveries, frozen pipes, limited cell service, and a contractor who charges extra because your driveway is an adventure? A cheap cabin is not cheap if every repair requires a special trip, a generator, and a friend with a four-wheel drive truck. Idaho shows the other side of the bargain. For generations, some cottage sites around beautiful lakes operated under state endowment land leasing arrangements. Families built memories on leased ground. But when a state looks at valuable lake lots and has a duty to generate returns for its trust beneficiaries, the emotional value of a family cabin can collide with the financial value of the land. Programs can change. Lots can be moved toward auction cycles. Leases can be set on defined timelines. Annual rents can reflect appraised land values that shock people who were used to an older version of the arrangement. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable, but it is necessary. The landowner has a purpose too. If the land is held in trust for schools, the agency may have a legal duty to manage it for revenue. If the land is national forest, the federal agency has to manage public land for public purposes. If the land is protected under a conservation easement, the agreement may be designed to prevent subdivision and development while allowing certain private or public uses. If the land belongs to a timber company, the company still has an economic land base to manage. Your dream cabin is sitting inside someone else's mission. That is not an insult. It is the entire deal. The reason you can get access at a lower cost is that you are not receiving full private ownership. You are receiving a defined use under defined rules. The rules are not the annoying part of the bargain. They are the bargain. New York's Adirondack region is a perfect example of why precision matters. It would be misleading to say the state simply leases ordinary people cabins all over the Adirondacks. The more accurate version is more layered. Some private timberlands are protected by conservation easements held or overseen in connection with the state. On some of those lands, private cabin site licenses may exist. The cabin holder may have a small privacy envelope, while the broader property remains working forest, conserved landscape, or open to public recreation in certain ways.
That creates a strange but beautiful trade.
You may get a cabin site inside a huge protected landscape, but you are not buying a private kingdom. You may have hikers, hunters, snowmobilers, timber activity, access rules, seasonal closures, and public recreation nearby. The forest is not yours. The silence is shared.
Some buyers love that. They like knowing the land around them is not going to become a subdivision. They like being surrounded by a much larger landscape than they could ever afford to buy. Others hate it because they thought cheap meant private. It usually does not. Cheap often means limited.
Limited duration, limited transfer rights, limited building rights, limited year-round use, limited rental use, limited financing options, limited privacy, limited future upside. Again, that does not make it bad, it makes it honest.
Now let us talk about financing.
Because this is where many buyers hit the first wall.
A normal mortgage is built around collateral the lender understands.
A house on deeded land is familiar. The lender can value the land, the structure, the market, the title, the lien position, and the resale path. A cabin on leased land is more complicated. The lender may not like that the borrower does not own the underlying land. The remaining lease term may be too short. The transfer process may be uncertain. The cabin may be seasonal. The structure may not meet normal lending standards.
There may be no year-round road, no conventional septic, no standard water source,
and no easy comparable sales. So many leased land cabins sell for cash, owner financing, personal loans, home equity from another property, or specialty local lending.
That does not mean financing is impossible. It means you need to ask earlier.
Not after you fall in love, not after you negotiate, not after you tell your family. Before.
Ask a local lender who has actually handled that type of cabin.
Ask what documents they need. Ask whether the remaining lease term is long enough. Ask whether they treat it as real estate, personal property, or something in between. Ask whether they require agency approval before closing. Ask whether insurance must be bound first. Ask whether the cabin needs a certificate, inspection, or proof of legal access.
If the lender sounds confused, that is information. Insurance is the next question.
A remote cabin with wood heat, seasonal occupancy, old wiring, limited fire protection, or difficult road access can be harder to insure than a normal house. If it is on leased land, the agency or landowner may require certain liability coverage or to be named in a certain way. If there is a dock, outbuilding, propane tank, generator, or guest use, those details can matter. If the cabin is near wildfire country, flood zones, heavy snow load, or shoreline exposure,
premiums can change the real math. Do not assume the insurance bill will be small because the cabin is small.
Then there are utilities. Many of these cabins look simple because they are simple. That may be exactly what you want, but simplicity still needs a checklist. Where does the water come from? A well? A spring? A lake intake? A hauled tank? A shared system? Is the water source approved? Is it seasonal? Has it been tested? Is there a recorded water agreement if the line crosses land outside the lease area?
What about wastewater? Is there a permitted septic system, a holding tank, an outhouse, a composting toilet, a gray water issue?
Is the system legal for the way you intend to use the cabin? Can it be repaired or replaced under current rules if it fails? Near lakes and streams, this question can become expensive fast.
What about power? Grid connection? Solar? Generator?
Propane? Wood stove? Electric baseboard? If the cabin has old wiring, has anyone inspected it? If the cabin uses propane, are the tanks owned or leased? If there is no power, are you actually ready to live that way for more than one romantic weekend?
And the road may matter more than the cabin.
Legal access is one of the most dangerous blind spots in unique property buying. A cabin can be physically reachable, but legally uncertain. A road can exist on the ground without giving you full rights to use it. A gate can be open today and locked next season.
A neighbor can tolerate access for years and then sell to someone who does not. A logging road can be passable in summer and impossible in spring. A public road can end miles before the cabin. A lease can allow access only through a designated route. Before buying, you want the access written down, not described casually, not remembered by the seller, written down. Who owns the road? Who maintains it? Who plows it? Who pays for gravel? Can emergency vehicles reach the cabin? Can contractors reach it? Can you bring in building materials? Can you park? Can guests come? Are there seasonal closures? Are motorized vehicles limited? Does the lease allow the kind of access you think you have? A cabin without reliable access is not a retreat. It is a storage shed with a view. Next comes use. Many people see a cheap cabin and immediately imagine living there full-time, renting it out, listing it as a short-term rental, retiring there, or slowly converting it into a permanent home. That may be impossible. Many leased cabins are for recreational use, not full-time residence. Some programs require that you maintain a permanent residence elsewhere. Some restrict commercial use. Some limit guests or rentals. Some require agency approval for improvements. Some prohibit expansion. Some allow only one dwelling. Some forbid certain structures near shorelines. Some require the cabin to retain a rustic or recreational character. This is where buyers get into trouble, because they confuse possession with freedom. Owning the cabin does not mean you can do anything you want with it. If you want to live there year-round, verify year-round residential use. If you want to rent it, verify rental rights. If you want to add a bedroom, verify expansion rights. If you want to replace the outhouse with septic, verify soil, permits, and lease approval. If you want to put in a dock, verify shoreline rules. If you want to clear trees for a view, verify vegetation rules. If you want to build a garage, verify structure limits. And do all of this before you negotiate price, because restrictions are not side notes. They are value. A cabin you can use only seasonally is worth different money than a cabin you can occupy year-round. A cabin you cannot rent is worth different money than a cabin that can legally produce income. A cabin with 5 years left on a lease is worth different money than one with a longer, stable renewal path. A cabin with an unpermitted septic system is worth different money than one with clean records. The seller may be honest and still not know the full answer. Families pass these cabins down for decades. Rules change. Paperwork gets lost. People use things the way their parents use them and assume that history equals permission. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. That is why your due diligence needs to go beyond the listing. Call the agency or landowner. Ask for the current lease or permit form. Ask for transfer steps. Ask whether there are violations, unpaid fees, required repairs, unauthorized improvements, pending rule changes, scheduled rent resets, public access issues, road issues, shoreline issues, or upcoming management decisions that affect the site. Ask whether the lease is renewable and what renewal depends on. Ask whether a buyer can inspect the file before closing. Then call the county. Ask how the cabin is assessed. Ask whether taxes are current. Ask whether there are open permits, septic records, building records, code issues, floodplain restrictions, or health department records. Ask whether the cabin can be used the way you intend to use it. Ask whether the address is recognized for emergency response. Then call insurance. Then call a lender. Then talk to a local contractor. Then visit in bad weather if possible. The dream looks best on the sunny day. The truth shows up when the road is wet, the crawl space smells damp, the lake is high, the mosquitoes are out, and the neighbor tells you where the water line actually freezes. This may sound like too much work for a small cabin, but the small cabin is exactly where people skip the work. They think, it is not that much money compared with a normal house. That is how a bargain becomes a trap. The purchase price is only the entrance fee. The real cost is the total cost of keeping the right to use the place without surprises. Now,
who is this actually good for? A leased land cabin can make sense for someone who wants recreation more than equity. Someone who already has a primary residence and wants a seasonal escape. Someone who is comfortable with rules, renewals, and maintenance. Someone who values location over control. Someone who would rather have a modest cabin near a lake than own a larger house in a less special place. Someone who understands that the money spent is partly lifestyle spending, not guaranteed investment. It can also make sense for a practical buyer who knows how to inspect old buildings, read lease documents, talk to agencies, and walk away when the paper does not match the dream. The best buyer is not reckless. The best buyer is patient. They do not chase every cheap listing. They build a map. They identify the state programs, forests, lake districts, cottage site areas, recreation residence tracts, timberland licenses, and camp communities where these properties exist. They watch quietly. They learn the fees. They learn the transfer process. They talk to local people. They write letters. They wait for a family that is ready to sell, and when the right cabin appears, they already know what to ask. That is very different from impulse buying a pretty cabin photo at midnight. Who should avoid it? Anyone who needs full-time housing, unless full-time residential use is clearly allowed. Anyone who needs a conventional mortgage and has no backup plan. Anyone who cannot afford surprise repairs. Anyone who gets angry at land use rules. Anyone who wants to heavily remodel without approvals. Anyone who expects private land appreciation. Anyone who needs to rent the cabin to make the numbers work, unless rental use is clearly allowed. Anyone who would be emotionally destroyed if the lease was not renewed someday. That last one matters, because these cabins invite emotional attachment. More than normal houses sometimes. A normal suburban house may be practical, but a cabin gathers memory in a different way. First mornings, cold swims, kids sleeping in bunks, coffee on the porch. The same chair by the same window for 20 summers. A place like that can feel like family. But a lease is not a feeling. It is a document. And the document is the deal. That is the hardest truth in this entire world of cheap cabins. The lower price is not magic. It is compensation for limits. The buyer gets access to a place they might never afford to own outright. The landowner keeps the land. The public purpose, trust purpose, conservation purpose, or timber purpose continues. Everyone gets something. Nobody gets everything. If you understand that, the arrangement can be beautiful. If you do not, it can feel like betrayal later, even if the rules were visible from the beginning. The strongest way to think about leased land cabins is not as a shortcut to owning lakefront property. It is as a long-term license to enjoy a specific place under a specific relationship. The relationship has value. The relationship has rules. The relationship can sometimes renew for generations, but the relationship is still not the same as a deed. Once you see that clearly, you can start comparing these cabins honestly. Compared with a normal stick-built house on private land, a leased land cabin may cost far less up front, especially in scenic areas. But it may be harder to finance, harder to insure, harder to improve, and less predictable at resale. Compared with a tiny home, a leased land cabin may feel more real because it already has a site, a setting, and a history. But unlike a tiny home on wheels, you cannot just move the whole dream somewhere else if the land relationship changes. Compared with prefab cabins, leased land cabins may offer better locations for less money. But prefab buyers usually focus on the structure, while leased land buyers must focus on the rights beneath the structure. Compared with buying rural land and building from scratch, a leased land cabin may save years of permitting, site work, driveway building, utility planning, and construction cost. But buying rural land gives you more control if zoning and budget cooperate. Compared with short-term vacation rentals, a leased cabin gives you continuity. You can leave your boots by the door. You can know the sound of the same rain on the same roof. But you also inherit maintenance, fees, rules, and responsibility. That is the trade. The final third of this decision is where most people should slow down. Because the biggest advantage of these cabins is not always the annual fee. It is not always the low purchase price. It is not even the view. The real advantage is access to a location that the private market would otherwise price out of reach. That is what you are buying. Not land, not unlimited control, not guaranteed appreciation. You are buying access, continuity, and a usable structure in a place that might be almost impossible to recreate today. But that advantage only survives if the lease is stable, the use is legal, the cabin is maintainable, the road is real, the utilities are understood, and the exit plan makes sense. The exit plan is the part nobody wants to talk about. Before you buy, ask yourself how you would sell. Who is the next buyer? Can the lease transfer? Does the agency approve the next person? Will a lender finance the next person? How much lease term will be left when you sell? Are there restrictions that shrink the buyer pool? If the cabin needs major work, will the landowner allow it? If the lease is not renewed, do you have to remove the structure? Would removal cost more than the cabin is worth? These are not negative questions. They are adult questions. A good cabin can survive them. A bad deal cannot. One of the smartest moves is to write a one-page buyer checklist and refuse to make an offer until every line has an answer. What exactly is being sold? Structure, improvements, personal property, lease assignment, permit application, membership rights, or something else? Who owns the land? What is the current lease or permit term? When does it expire? Is renewal expected, optional, automatic, discretionary, or uncertain? Can the lease or permit transfer to a buyer? Who must approve the transfer? Are there unpaid fees, taxes, assessments, violations, or required repairs? Are all improvements authorized? Is the cabin legal for the intended use? Is full-time occupancy allowed, or recreational use only? Are rentals allowed? What are the rules for guests? What utilities exist, and are they permitted? What septic or waste system exists, and is it legal? What is the water source? What is the legal access? Who maintains the road? What insurance is required? Can the cabin be financed? What happens if the cabin burns down? Can it be rebuilt? What happens if the lease ends? Can the structure be removed, sold, abandoned, or compensated? That checklist may feel cold, but it protects the warm part of the dream. Because the goal is not to scare you away from leased land cabins, some of them are wonderful. Some families have held them responsibly for decades. Some are located in places ordinary buyers could never reach through normal ownership. Some are modest, honest, beautiful little buildings that deliver exactly what people are missing: quiet, water, trees, a place to return to. The goal is to stop you from confusing affordability with simplicity. These cabins are affordable because the structure of ownership is different. Different can be good. Different can also be dangerous when treated like normal real estate. So if you ever find one, do not start by asking whether the porch is cute. Ask whose land it is. Ask what the lease says. Ask what happens when the term ends. Ask whether the cabin can legally do what you want it to do. Ask who approved the septic. Ask who plows the road. Ask whether the dock is allowed. Ask whether the last buyer had trouble getting insurance. Ask whether the agency file is clean. Then, after all of that, go stand on the porch. Listen to the wind in the trees. Look at the water. Imagine the mornings. Imagine the work, too. The damp crawl space, the annual fee, the renewal letter, the drive in the rain, the rule book, the limited resale pool. The possibility that this place is not a financial investment in the normal sense, but a life investment with paperwork attached. If you can accept both sides, you may have found something rare. Not a loophole, not a hack, not free land. Something better and more honest than that. A small legal doorway into a landscape you could not otherwise afford. For many people, that is enough. More than enough. They do not need to own the whole lake. They do not need to control the whole forest. They do not need a massive house to prove they made it. They just want a dry roof, a place for coffee, a legal right to return, and enough peace to hear themselves think again. That is the quiet power of these cabins. They remind us that ownership is not one single thing. There is the ownership of land, the ownership of a building, the ownership of a right, the ownership of a memory, the ownership of a season of life. And sometimes the most affordable home-like places in America exist because those things have been separated. But separated things must be read carefully. So the next time you see a cabin priced far below everything around it, do not assume it is a scam. Do not assume it is a miracle either. Look for the missing land. Look for the lease. Look for the permit. Look for the term. Look for the renewal clause. Look for the access. Look for the taxes. Look for the right to transfer. That is where the real story is. And if the story checks out, if the rules are clear, if the costs are honest, if the use fits your life, and if you can hold the place lightly enough to enjoy it without pretending it is something else, then a leased land cabin might be one of the last overlooked ways to get close to the water, close to the trees, and close to the kind of home feeling that the modern housing market has made so painfully expensive. But go in with open eyes, because the cabin may be yours. The stove may be yours. The old table, the screened porch, the rain barrel, the bunk beds, the stack of firewood, the view from the kitchen window, all of that may feel like yours. But the ground is borrowed, and borrowed ground can be a gift, as long as you never forget who owns it. So here is the question I would ask before signing anything. Would you rather own a normal piece of land in an ordinary place, or borrow an extraordinary place under rules you can actually live with? There is no universal right answer. There is only the answer that fits your money, your temperament, your risk tolerance, your family, your future, and your ability to read the document before falling in love with the doc. And if you have ever seen one of these cabins, or if you would consider buying one, leave a comment with the one thing you would check first: the lease term, the road, the water, the septic, the renewal rights, or the price. Because with this kind of cabin, the smartest buyer is not the one who dreams the biggest. It is the one who knows exactly what part of the dream is actually for sale.